All right, so we're going to take a look at this passage, and it's nice to get a whole picture of it, because what you want to kind of do is say, what's the big thing that happened in a passage like this? And why is it in the Bible? One of the things that is happening in this chapter, like in so many of the chapters we've read in Daniel, is you've got a contrast. You've got a contrast between Daniel, a righteous man, and some evil king. And that's kind of been going on all the way through Daniel, right? You got Nebuchadnezzar saying one thing, Daniel and his friends doing something righteous, and who ends up winning? It's just again and again and again and again in Daniel, the men of God who trust the Lord and honor Jehovah, Yahweh as the Most High, they end up in the victorious position, and the kings, they end up being humble and being brought low. And so we have a contrast of God's judgment of a wicked man with the divine discernment that God bestowed on Daniel. And that's a recurring idea in the book, and we're not supposed to miss that as we go through it. And the Bible is really constantly making this kind of contrast, isn't it? You've got somebody who exalts himself and ends up being humbled. If you think back even through the kingdom of Israel, you can think of people like that. Like, think of the very first king, King Saul. Saul exalts himself, he's handsome, he's big, he's tall, he doesn't consult with God, and he gets smashed. And who gets raised up in his place? This little shepherd boy who's humble and who's just out in the fields taking care of his father's flocks. He's the youngest in the family, and he gets exalted, and his name is David. So God keeps putting down the proud, and he keeps exalting the humble. And why is this going on in the Old Testament? It's almost like God is holding up for us portraits that he keeps painting. And they're like portraits that act as mirrors. We look at the portrait and we kind of go, oh, that's a little bit like me. And that guy had vices and sins and self-centeredness, and I got to make sure that I repent of that. And then you have these other pictures. You see these leaders like David, and you see Daniel, and they're mirrors too, and they're supposed to reflect something that God has either done for us or is doing in us. And so these are wonderful things to have these pictures that keep being put before us in the Bible. Daniel 5 is kind of a shocking picture, though, of what happens to the bad guy, to Belshazzar. What happens to him here? I mean, in one night, the judgment comes. Boom! And what we're finding out is that there is a divine judgment that's lurking in the background and ready to be revealed. In fact, Romans 1:18 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, ready to be revealed from heaven. So these are things that are ready to be revealed. God's judgment is right around the corner. And at the same time, you've got this idea that there is a way to be free and in the favor of God and enjoying the presence of God and his Spirit, and that's through Daniel. You see Daniel's picture, so that the picture of this is through the picture of Daniel of what God can be doing in our lives. Is this scenario something that we see in the New Testament? I think it is. Jesus basically says it like this in Matthew 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the road is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. However, narrow is the gate, and difficult is the road that leads to life, and a few find it. And if you take a look at Daniel, would you say Daniel's life was easy? Would you like to go through what he went through? It was pretty difficult, all of these things that were happening to him. And yet, it's clear that he is on the path to life. He has entered the narrow gate of trusting the triune God as his Savior, as his deliverer, as his all in all. And Daniel just presents to us this model of depending on Christ and enjoying all the benefits of walking with God, right? So you've got this contrast that's going on, and you've got these two figures who represent the contrast, Belshazzar and Daniel. And Belshazzar has a name that is special. What does it mean? And does it get at the heart of why he ends up judged? Belshazzar. What does Bel refer to? Baal. You've heard of Baal worship all the way through the Old Testament. Baal, Baal, Belshazzar. So he's named after Baal. And his name means, may Baal protect the king. May Baal protect the king. So his whole life, when he's heard his name, he's thought, Baal is protecting me. Isn't that ironic? In the end, how great was Baal at protecting him? Baal was not substantive. He had no power to resist Jehovah, Yahweh, God, judging this man. In other words, Baal doesn't exist. Yeah.
What is the origin thought of Baal? Because it does, I remember, I think the Phoenicians had a god that was very similar to Baal, more or less called Baal, but a little different. We're talking about over a long period of time. It seems like this guy was around.
Right. So Baal became this kind of like the Greek gods and goddesses. There's a pantheon of Baals.
Okay.
And so you end up having like the Baal of the river, the Baal of the valleys, the Baal of the Phoenician meadows, the Baal. All over the ancient world, it was just local Baal after local Baal. And they each had their local manifestations and their local little idols representing them. And what you really have here is pluralism. This guy that's dedicated to idolatrous pluralism in the name of some overriding entity called Baal that manifests himself in all kinds of localities in all kinds of different ways. And in many different cultures. It just dominated this area of the ancient world. And this king was dedicated to that quote-unquote God. This Belshazzar is probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So if you're a little confused about what's going on here, it would be just for you to be confused, because the translation is that Nebuchadnezzar was his father. And in the Asian culture, the ancient Asian culture, you could use father to represent an ancestor. So it's not necessarily his immediate father, it could be his grandfather. And we tend to think that. This is around 539 BC, so we're talking about maybe 586 is when the captivity occurs under Nebuchadnezzar. So maybe 47 years after Nebuchadnezzar. So we're talking about quite a bit of time after Nebuchadnezzar's day and after some of the events that we've already read in the early part of Daniel. Daniel here in this passage is probably 90 years old. So if we're setting the scene, we've got to see that this is 20 years later. We got to see, or 47 years later or so, that Daniel is older and that you've got a king who worships Baal. And then we go through here, and the very first 7 verses are going to help us really capture what's happening and why it's so evil. So let's just concentrate on these first 7 verses. King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. Under the influence of wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the kings and his nobles, wives and concubines could drink from them. So they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, wives and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised their gods, made of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Why the feast? What's the king doing? This is the Babylonian Empire. It's in 539 BC, and who's on their doorstep?
The Persians.
The Persians are getting ready to destroy them. They're not far away at all. And morale in Babylon was at an all-time low. So, when you're really down and you're really out, what do you need to do to solve your problems?
Hold the party.
Let's have a concert. Let's have a party. Let's just eat and drink and be merry. And that's exactly what Belshazzar comes up with. Boy, he's really got a lot of arrows in his quiver, doesn't he? He's able to party and get everybody riled up and have a good time drinking and drowning their sorrows away as they get ready to lose their empire. He's got no solution. His only solution is revelry and pleasure. And then, in the midst of all of his pleasure, he does something blasphemous. Oh, hey! Now that we're all drunk, hey! Go into the area where we keep those Jewish relics. You know, those old things from the temple in Jerusalem that my grandfather destroyed. My grandfather never had the guts to actually drink out of them, but I do. And he brings all the consecrated religious vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, and he brings them over to the feast, and he starts using them to glory in his own strength and to magnify the gods of Baal. The things dedicated to Jehovah God are being used blasphemously to honor the weak and vacuous Baal god. And this is what brings in the hand of God. Because in the next section here, you see in verse 5, at that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. Sometimes I think we wonder, is God there? Is God watching? Does God care? There's a sanctuary not too far away from here, around the corner, and every day this week that I drove past it said Jesus cares. And I think those are true words. I know those are true words, but we wonder, in the middle of all of our strife and what's going on, and when people aren't being righteous, and you see people getting away with what they're getting away with, you're like, does Jesus care? Is he watching? And what this verse in verse 5 affirms is, yeah, his hand is right at the door. It's ready to write the judgment right on the wall. And I wanted you to see, back in Daniel 4:35, I wanted you to hear this verse. This is what God told Nebuchadnezzar, or what Nebuchadnezzar ended up saying about the Most High God. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? And now we get 50 years later with Belshazzar's kingdom and the party, and all these Babylonians are raising their hands to the Baal gods who will protect the Babylonian empire and glorying in their strength and the greatness of Belshazzar, and the hand of God meets the toasting hands of the Babylonians, and the hand of God writes Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. People are like, what does that mean? Well, you know, it sounds crazy to us because it's in Aramaic, but it just means weighed and Mene Mene. I got to go back here for a second and get what's going on. It means numbered, weighed, divided. So Mene Mene means numbered. Numbered. It's like an emphasis. Your days are numbered. Your days are numbered, Belshazzar. You're not in control. In fact, the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Babylonian Empire, is numbered. It's got 1 day left. We've come to the end of the numbered days for this empire, Babylon. And then...
Why was Daniel so complimentary to the king when he interpreted that?
Yeah. In a way, I think Daniel sees this. I don't have to judge this guy. God's got the judgment. In fact, I'm prophesying about it. I don't need to get angry with this guy. God's got all the anger. And you know, that is one way of handling righteous anger. You know, people do things to us and we're like, that's not fair. And you know, if we react like most people, we could just get angry at people and insist on our revenge. And what we ought to do is say, God, you know about that. I'm not going to avenge myself. You take care of that. And God will. And then the weight's off of us. I don't have to get revenge. I don't have to take care of this problem. God ultimately will express his wrath. And Daniel knows the days are numbered. It's one day. So I think Daniel has this ability to put judgment in the hands of God. And that may be one explanation. There may be other dimensions to that. But anyway, he does this. He goes to the king, and the king says to him, the king gets him, and the king says, I'll give you something if you could interpret this for me. And what you noted earlier, Keith, is that Daniel actually said, you can keep that stuff. Well, why does Daniel say that? Probably what's going on is Daniel's basically just saying, I'm not going to do this for money. You're not going to bribe me to say something good about what that writing means. I'm just doing it out of the love for my God. And I don't do this for a paycheck. I don't do this because I'm trying to get anything. I'm not going to give you a twisted message. I want everybody to know I'm doing this for no pay. I'm saying it like it is. And he says it like it is. God judges that guy. And Daniel does end up getting the reward. Because on the other side, the authorities that were said, you would be the third ruler in the kingdom. All right, that's the basic dimension of what's going on here. Daniel 5 then is showing us that because people naturally pursue the vanities leading to destruction. What are those vanities? Pleasure, pluralism, pride of power, pride of position. Because people naturally pursue these vanities leading to destruction, we need supernatural perception like Daniel, that God Most High is the only source of exaltation. If you want to sum up this chapter in general, what you want to see is there's all these vanities of the Babylonian Empire, and there's all this wisdom, intelligence, skill by the Spirit of God given to Daniel. And Daniel gets exalted